Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel and another episode of the Reading the Room podcast discussion series. And today I have lovely guest Hannah from the channel Hannah May. She is one of the book hotties, one of my closest bookish friends. And I'm so excited to talk to her today about a variety of stuff. So Hannah, do you want to I'm sure everyone knows you that watches this, but do you want to have any introductory words?
Yeah, I always wonder that about like our crossover audience. So, like people sit and watch all the five of us at once. And I'm like, maybe.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm 25. I live in the Netherlands and I read literary fiction and non-fiction. And I'm disabled and chronically ill. And I read about that too. That's me.
Nice. So today we're going to be talking about two books in particular. One is The Employees by Olga Ravin, and the other is The Right to Sex. I have that one physically, Feminism in the 21st Century. These two books were in my top of the year last year. I know Hannah recently read them, and so I thought it'd be fun to chat with her and get her perspective on them. She teed up that she has some critique, I believe, at least of this one for sure. So I'm very curious. I didn't really talk to her about that. So Hannah, I'm very excited to see what you have to say about it. But I figured we'd start with, so I guess starting with The Employees by Olga Ravin. It is a dystopian fiction novel. And if you don't know what it's about, it is essentially this science fiction dystopian look at this workplace, which is basically a spaceship. And the book is told in a set of statements from the various employees that are working on this ship. And as the book unfolds, you learn more about why this committee is taking these statements of these employees, and some of them are human, some of them are not, and the book kind of unravels from there. So I guess before we dive into it too much, Hannah, what do you think about dystopian fiction generally? Like, do you read it a lot? I feel like you don't, but I could be wrong.
No, not at all. So I grew up reading a lot of it. Like when I was a teeny bopper, like that was my reading. I feel like that was like peak Hunger Games or Divergent. Like all of that was like so interesting to me. But I never really fell into like full fantasy. So I really only read dystopian fiction as a teenager. And then read like the Nobby classics, 1984, Animal Farm, like got into George Orwell, that kind of like more classic dystopian. And then when I became, I would say like more of a literary fiction reader, I sort of put it aside. I think I had read a few bad dystopian books, particularly in the like feminist genre. I feel like anyone who attempts to rehash The Handmaid's Tale is just like absolutely awful to me. And I read a few like The Power. I read another one about like to do with like people always play with the idea of like reproductive rights, and I think I got put off really quickly from reading a lot of those really bad takes that are really tropey. So this is really the first one I've read in like proper dystopian maybe in like 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, this one, I don't tend to read a lot of dystopian fiction too. I've similarly like loved Divergent. I loved like Hunger Games back in the day, but like currently now I don't tend to read it. But I thought this book was really interesting in particular because it is, I don't know if you agree with me, but I feel like it's quite experimental in the way that it's told in the set of statements, which I was kind of put off by initially. I was like, this is interesting in terms of, like a workplace committee gathering like bite-sized statements from a bunch of employees. I guess, what did you think about the style of the book in terms of it being kind of fragmentary in that sense?
Yeah, it was really interesting. And I had to really put my ego to the side, I would say, when I read this book, because I'm really used to reading. I do read experimental fiction, but it's very much realist. It's very much set in contemporary times, if not like recent history. And I'm used to picking up a book and understanding the perspective within the first chapter or so. But I feel like with this book, and maybe with more dystopian fiction in general, you really have to work hard as a reader, if it's done well, to sort of cement yourself in the time and place that they're talking about. So I was like getting frustrated, and my boyfriend Tom had read it before me, and I was leaned over to him and I was like, when do I start to understand what this is about? Because I'm getting annoyed now. I think that was like a criticism of me as a reader, being easily frustrated with not a straightforward narrative. Even though I do read experimental stuff like Sheila Heti and Rachel Cusk and people like that who play with these meta ideas, but it's for some reason easier to understand, maybe because you're more related to the characters. So I felt like that was really interesting as a general reading experience for me.
Yeah, and I think one thing that kind of makes that book a little bit inaccessible as well is like, given the dystopian experimental lens of it, I remember the statements. I read this like over 6 months ago, I want to say, so I'm kind of hazy on the specifics, but I remember some of the statements were very like brief, but they were very poetic and kind of abstract and vague. So it's like, if this was set now, I don't think like employees in a current workplace setting would not be saying the things that these employees are saying, you know, in response, because it's also like this look at, in the plot, there's like this set of objects that the spaceship collects, and it starts to affect like the minds and psyches of the employees on the ship. And so I think that kind of made it a little bit difficult for me too, getting into it. But I will say, I don't want to like spoil the book necessarily for people that haven't read it yet, but I will say the book, while it starts as like a collection of statements, it kind of veers left and has a little bit more traditional plot, I found by the end of it. Did you find that as well? And did that work for you?
Yeah, definitely. I think as time goes on, you sort of get a sense of time or space. Though for me, it wasn't necessarily grounded in anywhere in particular. And I don't know if that's me as a reader not having enough experiences of books set in outer space. Like that's not my genre of choice at all. So I couldn't, you know, when you read, most of the time you are, so much of reading relies on reference to previous experience, whether that's through other literature or your real life. And I felt like I was a real novice reader in this book, and I didn't have other building blocks to build this story on top of. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I didn't have examples of other spaceships or other AI characters or other people to imagine these characters to be similar to. And I've been reflecting on that a lot recently, in the idea of how much reading relies on previous knowledge and how that's a privilege as a reader. And I think, yeah, that was interesting for me, because I felt like I was really coming at this as like a novice to the genre, and then that sort of warped my perception of some of the setting.
Yeah, and I know similar for me too. I think one book that I read before this one that kind of helped my thinking or trying to like critically think about it was Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, in terms of this question of like human versus robot and what that kind of exposes for what it means to be human. And so what did you think about the mystery behind some of the statements not really being clear on whether the person giving the statement is a robot versus being a human? Was that interesting for you?
Yeah, I think that was, and I also read Clara and the Sun, so I guess that is the last dystopian I read, and I hated it. Like I really didn't get on with it. So I think it was something about the earnest nature that Ishiguro was trying to write in. I think that made it almost unrealistic for me. And I think this book does the opposite, in the sense that like these humanoid characters, although it's sometimes hard to decipher who is who, I think that speaks more to human nature than it does to like the potential progress of AI, if that makes sense. Like kind of the devoid of emotion that you could see in some of the workers. And I think it also reflects on this idea of like capitalistic mindsets and neoliberalism viewing all people as the same, just as cogs in the machine. I quite liked that divorced nature. Like it wasn't, like you say, it was poetic, but it wasn't necessarily, you weren't super invested in anyone. There wasn't really specific characters. They were kind of like a chorus.
Yeah, it definitely, kind of going on that. Did you think it was a good takedown or examination of capitalism? Like, did you need more from it, or do you think it did it well in the kind of very slim space that it had? It's a very unique position to, I think, examine.
And I've been thinking about this a lot recently. The role of a book, the role of an author to deconstruct or perpetuate social justice issues. And I think a lot of books I've read recently have done it really well. And I think I'm getting better at deciphering when it's done well and when it's done to the nth degree that it becomes ineffective. But I think you also have to remember that yourself as a reader, someone approaching this book who maybe doesn't have views about abolition politics or ideas about late capitalism, then this would not make a lot of sense. So I think that's important to remember. And I think I myself am easy to critique books I feel are too on the nose, when if someone's reading that as an introduction, then that's really helpful. But I feel, I think this was done in an obscure enough way to make it feel like I wasn't being lectured at or moralized, and at the same time, it didn't simplify the idea that like we're all just workers under capitalism, which by now we all know. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, in terms of that question of kind of accessibility too, what do you think about this book being shortlisted for the Booker International Prize last year?
Yeah, so I'm not a follower of the prize that much, except through you and our friend Kieran, who are big fans. But I think it's interesting to consider the translation aspect of this. And I read a couple of articles about the translation, and obviously this is in the Danish context, right?
Yeah, I think so.
And that is obviously interesting to think. It's the idea of it being set in space appeals to the universality of capitalism as a concept. I don't know a lot about the Danish experience of workers, but my understanding, or at least the perception from the outside, is that they have a better work-life balance than us, and whether or not that's a preconceived notion we have in North America and in the UK, that they've got it easy. And obviously this writer's coming at it from a perspective of saying, well, we don't really, it's just a different kind of oppression, or it's a different experience. Eventually the whole world will go through this transition. So I think that's interesting on the international level, but I didn't feel like necessarily, for me at least, as a not someone that aware of Danish politics, it didn't feel super specific, like, of a Danish book.
I'm kind of new to like following book prizes, particularly the Booker International Prize, but I just found it, I don't really know too much of the reputation, so I'm probably not speaking from a place of knowing too much about it, I guess. But in terms of how experimental it was, I'm just kind of surprised that it got such big recognition, I guess. And I felt like at the same time, a lot of the shortlisted books were kind of playing with this interesting blend of nonfiction and fiction, like a lot about history and examining, so this one wasn't really about history, I guess I would say. But so that kind of made me, I don't know, I was just interested in the fact that it was so recognized, I guess, last year. Just such a weird book to me that I'm just surprised, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think I'm quite skeptical in general of the industry behind prizes, and obviously so many hands that dive into the pot that decide what happens with it. And I think from my experience being on the book internet, I always followed the Booker Prize. Like, that was how I picked my fiction. It was like a prize my mum knew, so it was like how I read a lot of books like Marlon James and like those big literary hitters. I read without much context of the wider publishing world. I just knew it was a prize that published kind of weird books, and I liked kind of weird books at the time. So that, I guess, the legacy of Booker has now become, at least not in the international sense, I think has upheld some of that integrity of weirdness or obscurity. But I think lots of people would agree that in the mainstream Booker, that we're moving towards a much more commercial markability, being like something that people are interested for, something that the judges, if not consciously, are subconsciously looking for when they choose winners of the prize. So I think maybe in the future I'll sway more towards the international than I would to the mainstream Booker, which is interesting.
Because I feel like this book definitely like requires essentially like a reread, I think, to fully kind of unpack what it's doing, at least for me personally.
Yeah, I could have picked it up again and like started again straight away and like really did a deep dive analysis, particularly of the language using. So I think there's some really subtle co-opting of corporate speak and jargon, and I think that running through it as a thread is, yeah, like contributing to that idea of late capitalism without banging you over the head with it like capitalism is bad, which is, I think, quite a dull way to write a piece of fiction.
Absolutely. So that is The Employees. You overall recommend it, correct?
Yeah, definitely. If
okay.
not just, yeah, it just as an experience, I think it's an interesting book.
Okay, so moving gears quite a bit, we're going into some nonfiction. So now we have The Right to Sex. This is a book that was in my actually top 5 of the year, both fiction and nonfiction. I adored it. Kind of teeing up what this book is about. There are, I think, is it 6 essays? Yeah, 6 essays about various topics in feminism. What I love so much about this book is that I feel like the author, Amia Srinivasan, she's really having this kind of more so like philosophical debate and conversation with herself and with the reader about, and like proposing a ton of questions within these 6 topics. And I really enjoyed that as a reader, not really feeling like it was, well, it was a ton of learning I found in this book, but I felt like it was more so trying to jog your brain and kind of exposing your own biases and really reflecting on why you think about feminism in a certain way, and kind of considering other, maybe older views of feminism and why it was sort of kind of considered outdated, or whether we can kind of learn something from older perspectives of feminism or not. So that's why I loved it. But so I'll give you the floor. What do you think about this book?
No, I really enjoyed it. And it is a book I recommend specifically. And I want to preface this by saying I'm coming at it from a really different place to you. Like, social justice is something I study in my master's. Feminism is something I've read about for a really long time. Like, it's not, I wasn't reading this as my eyes were not being opened to new ideas. So, and I think it's a really good book for that purpose, particularly for men, particularly for people who haven't necessarily taken an interest with or like really grappled with these ideas. So I think for that, it's really interesting. Although this is where I sort of come into some trouble, because I think if you're going to present it as a book like that, I don't think it's accessible enough for it to be that, because I think the language is often convoluted. It's quite densely written in some essays more than others, and I don't think necessarily there was a continuity between the essays. I felt like there wasn't necessarily like as particularly a language continuity, or I don't know, they didn't feel consistent to me. And I think that's also in part because she got this book deal off the back of the essay The Right to Sex, which she published on the London Review of Books, which was in answer to, or at the same time as the Elliot Rodgers incel shooting. So that's the essay I think potentially was the strongest. And I found most interesting when she then went on to produce almost like a list, like a set of rebuttals to the critiques she received for that original essay. And I really liked that experimental, like, use of bringing the reader in and explaining what had happened and what's happening now, and I really liked that. But I think you're either a person who likes fence sitting books or not, and I think and I'm definitely hypocritical of like sometimes I like them and sometimes I don't, but in this case it felt like for me it was very much a view from above, which is like this critique that we see in social justice academic circles. I'm actually writing an essay about it right now, where she defines herself as a contemporary philosopher, and it's where philosophers often look down on an issue, present all of its problems, and then walk away as if it's not their job to do anything about it. And I think I found that quite frustrating, maybe because that's on my mind more recently because I'm reading about it in like a work way, or just because she's dealing with topics that are so sticky that it almost feels like a cop-out to be like, oh, well, I guess that's it, isn't it? What are we gonna do? You know?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's so interesting because I think that's something that I kind of felt when I was reading this, in terms of, I was like, I think many people I would think would not like this book for that reason too. Like you're saying, like, I think the only essay in which I felt she had a strong argument or thesis was the one about, what is it called? On not sleeping with your students, which she's very, from what I took, is she's very against that. And I feel like that was the only one where I felt like she had a strong, definitive like answer to the questions that she proposes. I don't know if you agree with that though.
Yeah, I think she did, except where she goes on to talk, like, it seems like the conclusion she came to was that blanket bans and like in evoking carceral feminism in that sense is justified, as in we should ban student-teacher relationships. But then about 4 paragraphs before, she says, we know that these policies inflict trauma upon more marginalized groups, whether that's men of color, mentally ill people, or undocumented immigrants. And I thought, okay, yeah, so we've acknowledged that that doesn't work, but still I wasn't totally clear what her final argument was, that we should make blanket bans anyway, even though we can identify the problems with them, or we should just hope. I think this is also where it got a bit sticky to me, that she uses the word politics so often, sexual politics, the politics of feminism, and I really wasn't actually sure what she meant by politics by the end.
Mm-hmm.
Did she mean the legality of it? Did she mean global policy, or did she mean individual social responsibility? So when it came to the sleeping with your students, was it that she wants to, obviously she says in the introduction, like, feminism is a movement, we're reimagining a utopian, and I got that all from her, and I'm not saying she needs to provide concrete answers to what we do in the current state of affairs, but it didn't seem like I even knew what she wanted to do in this new imagined post-feminism world.
So I guess kind of going to this topic of her not having a clear answer, what do you think about, I don't want to say something incorrectly, not like leaning on older views of feminism, but even considering them? Because I feel like a lot of contemporary feminist thinking is very, I mean, she explores this in the book, that it's very contradictory, I guess, for the lack of a better word, or kind of thought of as problematic, particularly like in the pornography essay, in which like this question of whether pornography has any benefit to women, or is it only to serve men, and how, you know, older feminists believe that porno is just completely horrendous for women, but now it's kind of viewed as something that can be a mechanism for women to succeed under capitalism. Do you have any thoughts on her exploring those things, or even considering them, or do you think it was kind of problematic?
I don't know. I have read from other, I obviously wasn't alive during those waves of feminism to say like I was really in the movement. I've only read what I've read about people at the time, but it seems like she was flattening some of those arguments, and I understand she has to condense them to fit in the book. But I read a really interesting essay, I'll link it, or I'll send you to link, about those discussions of older feminism being devoid of the queer element, and the time where those conversations about pornography, and she makes it seem like it's a very clear cut of like anti and pro feminist, but actually there was this middle ground that was particularly linked to the queer politics of desire. And I would say overall, I don't know, you can speak as a gay man, like if you thought this was like heteronormative to the point of being problematic, because I can't really speak on that as someone who's like not that involved in the community.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I kind of brought my own perspective, particularly in the core essay, The Right to Sex, in which he talks about incels and this question of whether what we desire personally, how that's tied to, you know, her kind of abstract politics that she proposes in terms of like, as a gay man on like grinder culture, when we have men that are on there that are like no fats, no femmes, no Asians, no blacks, and like what that means for personal desire. And she didn't really, I think she might have touched on it briefly, but I don't know. I feel like when I was reading this, it felt quite intersectional to me. Like she doesn't dismiss those arguments, but I don't think it's essentially rooted in it per se.
No, and I think, and that's fine. And it's something which is like a wider question I've been toying with recently, even in my own writing and reading other people's writing, is like, it seems like now it's like, the assumption is you must acknowledge your privilege and then that's all you need to do. So you just say like, I acknowledge I'm a white straight sized woman, and this essay is going to focus on heteronormativity because I'm in a hetero relationship. And then I think, I don't know where it gets to the point where it becomes quite self-serving. And I was reading, I think particularly on the essay about students having sex, that I felt that sometimes veered into like quite a binary understanding. Obviously, I know she was using data that suggested there was like more male professors contributing to this problem than there were female, but she does mention a few female ones, but sort of like leaves them to the side. And I thought I really wanted her to like go more into that and unpack that. But I know that she sort of set out the parameters of the book to say this is what she was going to do. So I don't think it's fair to critique her for the things she didn't do.
I think your critiques are very interesting. I'm so glad I talked to you about it, because I hadn't really talked to anyone that read this book, because I don't know, have you seen a lot of people talking about this book on the internet at all?
Not in like this realm of the internet that I hang out with you in, but in other realms of the internet I hang out in, like journalism, Twitter, and like stuff I get into with work. I've seen a lot of like really quite savage critiques of it, and then I've seen other, like it was like big Twitter discourse in the small echo chamber of Twitter that I live in for work, which I thought was interesting, that particular readings of particular books and the way they transfer out of my like bookish life into like when they make it, I assume it's more mainstream because it's like people who get recommendations mostly from like newspapers or like big websites or London Review of Books, so they're reading like, you know, whatever's in vogue kind of thing, which is, yeah, some of that did inform my thinking on the critique because I read it before I read the book.
Me personally, like I'm kind of, I guess, newer to really critically thinking about feminism, which, just being honest, I mean, I haven't really read too much before. I haven't really studied it too much. And so I think maybe that's another reason why this book worked really well for me in terms of kind of giving a very high level understanding of various, you know, different feminist groups of thinking, and just kind of understanding that before considering my own views on feminism, I guess, up to now, which I hadn't really thought about before too much, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it is a useful tool for that. And I think it's the same as when we consume nonfiction, like it always needs to be consumed in a critical way. And I think that's where I struggle maybe with books like this, when they hit the zeitgeist and people say, or they're marketed particularly as like, this is the answer, this is the book or the only book you need to ever read about the current state of sexual politics. And then people tend to take the words as gospel, almost out of fear of not wanting to critique it, because we have this like idea of writers as these like pedestaled gods. So we're like, oh my God, they wrote a non-fiction book, they must be so smart. Who am I to think about it in any other way? And I think that problematizes it further when, you know, it's not an expansive book and it is just a set of essays at the end of the day that could have easily been published over the course of a year in the New York Times. Like, it's just because I think when it's put into a book as well, people tend to, I know, worship its ground maybe a bit more. No, I'm not saying you're doing that. I just mean like the way people are talking about it and the way it's been marketed on my book, like internet as well, has been very like, you know, sort of the way people spoke about Three Women, and then a year later people reflected like, okay, actually no, that book wasn't actually that good, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And I do think one thing about this book though is that I feel like she's kind of very receptive and open to criticism, I think. I feel like the book kind of asks for like as much criticism as people want to give it, whereas I feel like other books kind of try to be this, I don't know, kind of answer to a question. And I feel like this one
Yeah,
doesn't. So I don't know.
yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's why I love the essay so much, where she was like responding. And I almost wish it was an entire book of her responding to her publishing these essays, because I didn't feel like they fit together as a collection super tight, like under the vague umbrella of like sexual politics of desire. But yeah, I really loved when she fed back on her feedback from the Elliot Rodgers essay. And yeah, I agree. And I think that's like very like humbling, and I appreciate that, because obviously we see so many authors just double down on views when they're picked out, and especially when it's something like this, it's like hard to separate those views from the author in a way that people then come for them in like a very personal way, which is obviously like not okay. It's interesting thinking about Three Women actually, and how, but that's the same, that fell foul to its own marketing. And I don't know if maybe this could do the same.
Yeah, I still haven't read Three Women. You read it, right?
Yeah. And I liked it at the time. I liked it more than I like it now, which is just like growth as a reader and as a person. I read it just like really soon after it came out, because my mum had a copy and read it and was like, oh, you'd like this. Although that wasn't necessarily in the same scope, like the style is very different, but it is, I think, if not purposefully, inadvertently attempting to be a polemic, or marketed as one.
What's interesting too is that this book actually, this was sent to me like out of the blue from the publisher, which I thought was kind of interesting. I don't know if I would have picked it up like immediately unless it was sent to me, but I wonder, I don't really have anything, I don't know else to say about that, but I find it interesting that like how publishers choose to kind of blind send certain books to reviewers. I don't know.
Yeah, I would love an insight into how and why. Like that's more of a thing in the US. I think like when I was in England, like I didn't get that many unsolicited books, and if I did, they were mostly from like indie publishers. But your guys' system, although it's funny because Orion, who published in the UK, I think they also published in the US, they're, I think, moving to like that email system that you guys do for some of them, where they like send it, because we don't have that. Like you just personally request what you want.
It's often a beneficial system, but also it's kind of, I don't know if it's particularly effective. I don't know. I'd have to get like a publisher insight on it, but like just sending a mailing list where you can just kind of like select what you want sent to your house is kind of interesting to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I would love the stats on like how many reviews they get out of it, sort of like that kind of stuff, because I do wonder about how, to me it seems like suspiciously easy to get books in America, like compared to, and I wonder about how they like mark that up. And I think that also leads into our conversation about books as consumerism, because I feel like maybe that sort of contributes, particularly in like the micro book influencing space, to like books as objects or books as things to collect.
Yeah. I mean, on that topic, so I know you mentioned on your channel like your thoughts on book buying this year and like general goals that you have. So what are your goals for this year in terms of book consumption and buying?
Yeah, so I'm doing something new. So I live abroad, so my access to like libraries is very limited, particularly like I know also you guys in the States and like friends I have over there, like your library seems so good for the most part. If you live in a big city, like you can request what you want and stuff and just wait for it. But obviously, like I live in a country where English isn't even the first language. So yeah, I don't really have access to that. And also I have a personal library. Like I buy books and I collect them with the idea that one day I'll own my own home and can put all my books in a room kind of thing. Like, which I think in itself needs to be deconstructed, because maybe that's not right either. So this year I'm doing, for every 5 books I read from my shelf, so that doesn't include proofs I've been sent by publishers or e-galleys or e-books I read through my e-reader, then I can like buy myself 1 book, but I'm not going to go out to the bookshop every time I read 5, you know what I mean? I'm just collecting them as like a way of measuring it. And then I'm also just not buying any books in January, because I like got loads of, or not loads, but I got a few books over Christmas and just before. And I think so far, I mean, this is like coming up to the end of the first month, and I've noticed, I think I've read 11 books so far this month, and only 5 have been on my shelf, so less than half. So I think that's interesting, because I didn't really realize how much I was reading from NetGalley specifically, and then also just like reading proofs that came in.
Yeah, and I'm curious about your perspective on the idea of like backlist versus new releases. So like for me personally, this is something I'm trying to get out of the habit of thinking. Like I tend to find like, so say even like 2 years ago, I purchased a bunch of like newer releases that I was excited about. then my reading habits have kind of changed since then. And then also being a book reviewer online where I have this maybe false assumption that they want reviews of like newer books that are kind of hot on the market. I tend to not look down on, but like not consider the older books that I bought 2 years ago as like being hot on my list of books to read because they're older. But when it's kind of more bigger, much older backlist books, like I'm more open to reading those because more people kind of are familiar with them or curious about them rather than maybe a smaller book that came out 2 years ago. I don't know if that makes sense, but do you have any like similar thoughts on that, or do you get around that
Yeah,
somehow?
I think it's interesting. And I think there's obviously this like compare and despair narrative with social media. And I think it definitely plays into the book community or the book space online where people often comment, how do you read so many books? How do you buy so many books? How do you acquire so many books? And I think it's this idea of, I think it was Simon or someone else I watched was like, I read a lot of books because I know the people watch me don't read as many books as I do, but I'm just reading all of them to tell you which ones are the best. And I think like that makes sense to me. It's like I don't read as much as I do. Like I read as much as I do because of the personal circumstances of my life and my health mean that I do. I think I actually just wrote an essay on this that's coming out in O Reader, the literary magazine, about like if I wasn't as sick as I am, I would not read as much, and I'm okay with that. Like we have our friend Grace reads inordinate amounts of books. I can't imagine ever reading that many books if I wasn't at home so much because of my illness. So I think there's a really interesting dynamic about like the particular space you hold as like reviewing books online and sort of what that means for new releases. And I think there's some real didactic thinking about people saying like, oh, you should read more backlist, or you should do this, or you should do that, and it's sort of like forgets the fact that we're just reading for fun anyway. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and that's the thing. Like for me, whenever I pick up a new book, for example, I always think about like the opportunity cost that comes with picking that book and like looking at my shelves and like I'm choosing this one book and I have shelves that are like full of potential
Yeah.
things to read. And like if I choose this, I'm limiting my, I don't know, opportunity to read those books. And like, I don't know, that kind of stresses me out as a reader, but I'm trying to like just get out of that headspace because it doesn't matter at the end of the day. Because you're right, we're just reading for fun. Read what you want to read in the moment, and then the books will always be there if you own them, physically. But
yeah, I think it makes sense like to have, and I think that's what I've realized, and I think your reflection on as well is like you bought books 2 years ago and now you're a different reader. Like if you are a mood reader, it does like logically make sense to have a smaller TBR because your tastes change so often. Like there are books I know on my shelves that like I'll eventually read, but like I'm not going to read them right now because they're like 600 pages and really complicated, or they're just like not tickling me at the moment kind of thing, but I might come back around to them, and I think
yeah,
that's fine. And I think I don't, there's some really bad takes about like, whoa, focusing on new releases is so bad. Well, it's not, because a lot of these new releases are from debut authors, from authors from previously underrepresented backgrounds, from people who've only just recently been able to sit down and have the time to write a book because they've grown up in circumstances that meant they're not making the Forbes under 30. Like it forgets all of the work that goes into producing a book. And I think as someone who's trying to write a book and also someone who writes like for a job, you realize that like people are so quick to devoid anything you produce as anything other than something to consume. And I think that's where it becomes really depressing for me. And that's why I liked Mona that I read recently that we spoke about, because I think that book really set a light under me to say like the way we navigate the literature at the moment is needs to implode on itself because it's not sustainable as the way people like talk about books. Like I've seen so many bad takes recently that Zadie Smith shouldn't have written a book with a Pakistani main character, even though the book is partially autobiographical and based on her life in North London. That men should stop writing women altogether, or that just so many blanket statements. I think that publishing books in hardback is classist. Like these huge statements. I'm like, do you actually think about what you're saying right now? Because you're talking about as if books are just a thing, like an object, not someone's life work.
yeah, big time. And that's something to, not to kind of veer a little bit, but like in terms of being a micro influencer and like, admittedly trying to get free books and galleys. And that kind of makes me reflect too on like not completely banning my book buying, because I also like to support, indie publishers and authors and debuts, and really like, not, we do sell books even if we get like a free book and we talk about them on BookTube, I'm sure we sell a good number, I would think. I don't know.
Yeah,
But
definitely. I think you can't underestimate the personal influence you have. Even like even before I made content about books, like I was always the person my friends came to for books. So if I said to everyone, you need to read this book, then 3 out of 10 of my friends would have gone and bought it and read it. So that sounds really, it's not like I've always been an influential person, but just like your own personal self, like your own influence, whether or not it's online or not, is still contributing. And I don't think if all like the top 25 literary fiction booktubers went on a book buying ban for a year, like the industry would not implode. And I think we tend to sometimes, as people on the internet, center ourselves when like we're not personally keeping Waterstones or Barnes and Noble running. Like there
yeah.
are like, and I think about a lot with my mum, because my mum's a reader, like a voracious reader, like obsessive, a greedy reader. Like she'll read 10 books in 7 days and then not pick up a book for a month. And she gets all her recommendations from the newspaper, and she buys all her books from Waterstones, and she is contributing like a substantial amount of money to the book industry, and she has no idea that the book internet existed until I went on it, you know. And I think we tend to sometimes center ourselves as like, you know, the rise of book talk and, you know, online reviews and stuff like this, when like people have been buying and producing books for a long time, since before we had any say in it.
Yeah, big time. And I forget, I said this recently in a video of mine. Oh, in my 2022 like reading goals and BookTube plans video, I follow these two drag queens, and something that they said recently really stuck with me in terms of like, if I'm ever like worried about like my internet presence, or like thinking that people are like, you know, hyper like analyzing me on my channel, or really thinking about what I'm doing, they're always like, no one's thinking about you, no one cares. like people do, but like to put less pressure on yourself to think that you're like the center of publishing. Or like even like when a publisher sends me a book and I haven't gotten to it in a while, like I sometimes find that I get nervous, like they're watching me or something. But I'm like, no, they're not thinking about you. They have bigger, you know, their profit and losses to think about, rather than just you if you read the one galley that they printed, you know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I think, like you say about like not going on blanket bans, and I think, I mean, I'm just a big proponent of like not doing anything as a universal rule. Like universal rules, whether in books or real life, just don't work for me, and I don't think work in a wider sense either. And I think, like you say, supporting indie publishers is a lot different to just buying the next Simon and Schuster release. Like that, when you buy an indie book, and I've got friends or people I've met online who work in these indie book publishing houses, they really are sometimes run out of one person's front room. They print the leaflets in their home, like they bind the books. They're so like, some of these are so DIY and so small that like you really are making a difference when you buy from them. And I feel like that's an ethos I carry, whether it's about books or clothes or food or whatever, because I have the economic privilege to choose where I spend my money, which obviously is a caveat that comes with buying books in general. That like supporting an indie publisher, I think, is like so worthwhile in those times, you know. And even if not supporting it, if I promote a book by an indie publisher, like I always feel like I'm doing like such a better, like that's such a better way for me to spend my time than it is for me to read, like talk about a book that everyone else is talking about. That's not to say I don't read those books, because my number one thing is I read for enjoyment, but I really try and think about like, okay, if I promote this book that an indie publisher has sent me, then that I'm doing something that could like really contribute to their well-being and their like profit.
Totally. And that's a really good perspective too, because I was thinking about this weekend, because I recently got the new Otessa Moshfegh book that comes out in June from Penguin Random House. And I kind of like joke about how, I don't know, my internet persona is being like a Moshfegh stan. I just think it's funny to kind of like play into that in a sense. And I wonder if like, if I put more of my energy into promoting, you know, a smaller title, like a debut author, rather than someone who's clearly established and is, you know, adapting her books for film right now, and doesn't need my, you know, my standing to help her out. Like, I don't know, something I've been thinking about recently.
Yeah, I think it's just also not about like tying your, like, I feel like, yeah, I predominantly read a certain type of book, or people could probably pin down the kinds of books I would like, but like I say, read for myself and read for enjoyment. So I'm not going to not read anything, which is why I don't, everyone, like people's reading preferences are up to them. Do you know what I mean? Like I can say, I'm not going to read the new Hannah Yanagihara because it just doesn't sound interesting to me, even though I could make a butt ton of content about it if I did. But like, I just don't want to read it. It's not interesting to me. And I think we were talking with CJ the other day about like preferences versus like what you should do versus what you can do. And I think that's also really interesting. And
I think it'll change, I guess, in the question, but at the end of the year, your perspective on any of this.
I don't know. I feel like I have, like, I always want to be changing. I always want to be evolving. And I think I used to have really, maybe hard and fast rules for things, whether that's like, I don't buy books on Amazon, which I don't, but I don't instruct other people not to do that because I understand the circumstances in which someone might do that. Or I don't read cis het white men, or I do because sometimes they write books I'm interested in, but you can not read them if you don't want to. I don't think anything I ever talk about is, I never want it to be instructional for someone else. Yeah. Unless I'm talking about like a book where it's like blatantly racist, homophobic, though everyone has those like tolerance lines where they're going to talk about it. But what I don't like is sometimes I think when you talk and write about books on the internet that sometimes people sort of want to come at it from a very moralistic point of view and a very like, well, didn't you see that she once did a tweet in 2016 that said this about Jewish people? So how do you feel about that now? Why are you promoting? It's always saying we're promoting books. Like, we're just talking about books. We're not saying you have to buy it. And do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, sometimes I get a bit frustrated with the one-wayness of internet.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that. That's something, it's kind of been at the core of a lot of our, I think, reflections this year on being on the book internet and like cancel culture generally. And I feel like it's an interesting time to be on the internet. And I often feel kind of weird about it. But I luckily haven't had too much, pushback on anything that I've created, but something that kind of keeps me up at night sometimes about like if I'm going to regret in 5 years how I talked about certain books or something, or I don't know.
Yeah, same. But I think that kind of comes down to like overall the way that we, like, the worst thing you can be in 2022 is a hypocrite. And I think like we need to normalize like not necessarily making mistakes, but just like changing your opinion and changing your mind. And I think that comes with, okay, people who want to change their mind talking about it, but also the people who respond to that, not coming at people as if it's like, how dare you have even done that in the first place? As if the people saying that are like, I don't know, birthed from their mother's wombs and have never done anything wrong in their life. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I find that all quite, it's just the black and white thinking, I think, that runs through so many of the things that go on the internet.
Definitely. Well, that was a really good conversation. Thank you so much. I feel like we covered quite a variety of dystopian fiction, feminist stuff, book buying, but I don't know. I feel like it all kind of ties together in a sense. So thank you so much for coming on the pod again. You've been on, was it once before or twice before?
Well, with CJ, we came for the Rooney special.
Yeah, the first ever episode.
Yeah.
By the way, I watched that again recently and it was like very good, I would say.
Did you? Like,
yeah, it's stressful because that one was live too. So that was quite brave of us to just jump full into it. Yeah, thank you. I'm sure, hopefully, if you would be interested to come on again in the future to talk about more things, there's always stuff that we're chatting about in the group chat that I think would reflect really well for people that watch us. So
group chat live, that's what we're trying to do.
Right. So I'll link all of your stuff below in the description. Follow Hannah, do all the things if you like our content. But I will catch you all in the next one. Bye.